This is the meeting with the senior members of our organization, and they are going to talk today about when Nuremberg got started. Can't put that there. And Joan, if you'll start introducing yourself from across.
Okay.
Each one of you introduce who you are and when you got to Nuremberg.
I'm Joan K. Adrian. My maiden name was McCarter. I went by K. McCarter. So when I send emails, I always have to add the K or they're going to confuse me because we had so many Joans, Joannes, Jeans, Jeanettes at the school that about a dozen of us would turn around at any J name that came along. So anyway, I got there, actually I only did half of my senior year there. My stepfather and my mother invited me to go over with them. I had been living in Oklahoma with my father, and so I came with them. And we were a little bit late getting his orders, and so I only did half of my senior year, and I still graduated with 2 credits over. But anyway, it was an interesting time, and I stayed on. I went to work in the Palace of Justice after I graduated, and met my husband there. We were married there, honeymoon in Capri, and then we had our first child. I was there 5 years. Now you can get a lot done in 5 years if you just keep moving. So I got over there in November of 48 and did not leave until October of 53. So I was there during the occupation years. The occupation actually ended in the middle of, in June of 1952, and we became regular NATO sources.
Okay, let's have Betty introduce herself, and then we'll come back and talk after you.
Go ahead.
Okay, my name is Betty Thomas. I've been married a couple of times, but I took my maiden name back. So I went there in 1950, and in my beginning of my freshman year, and I graduated on June the 6th, 1954. Was in Wiesbaden 2 days later, and we came home. So I was there from all 3 years. Same school, never transferred. Big memory in my life, believe me.
But you were there when they made the change, too.
Yeah.
When they switched.
Introduce yourself.
My name is Jack Phillips. I got to Nuremberg July of 1949. So I was going into my junior year. So I actually graduated in 1951 from Nuremberg High, and then my dad got transferred to Kaiserslautern. At the same time, this University of Maryland in Munich was opening up, so I was there in the dormitory. And then we went home. All of this before I was even 18 years of age. Anyway, that's it. Oops.
Introduce everyone.
I'm Bob Russell. I guess I was asked to talk because I was one of the first dependents from the United States to show up in Germany in 1946. And so it was a very different experience for me, and I will talk at my appropriate time when we get to that.
I'm William Arthur Short, better known as Bill. I got to Nuremberg in June of 1947. Graduated in the class of 49 after 2 years in Nuremberg, what we call Nuremberg Dependence High School. Most of the kids in the school objected to the word dependence, and I kept asking them if they were paying for their own room and board, and they would say no. I said, then you're a dependent.
My name's Gary Grassel. I think I got to Germany before anybody here. 1934, because my dad went over there to get a PhD, and I ended up in Germany. My dad ended up in the U.S. Army. He fought in the whole war, but my mother and I were over there. We were separated. I mean, we just missed the boat because in summer 39, Hitler stopped all travel, so we were over there, and we couldn't get over here. So I experienced the whole Second War, and I got post-traumatic stress disorder from the American Air Force. Okay, that's it.
Wow.
Yeah, we had someone join the group. Introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry I'm late here. My name's Bob Bouts. I got to Regensburg, Germany in January 1949 to 17 days on the Atlantic. A lot of the times we were making about 14 knots just headed into the wind because the storms were terrible that year. Regensburg was about 65 miles from Nuremberg, and though I was just barely 13 years old at the time, we arrived, my dad had been there 6 months, so we already had a house that was fully furnished from the acquisition that had taken place during the beginning of the occupation forces. There was nothing done in the way of reconstruction at that time whatsoever. And the train stations of Bahnhofs were, some of them partially destroyed. They just bulldozed out streets and had done very little more than that. In Regensburg, 65 miles from Nuremberg, I was the only high school student by the time 1948 rolled around. I was ready for my 5th freshman year. There was no other high school students in in Regensburg. So I had to take the train from Regensburg on Sunday evening and go to Nuremberg, get on a streetcar, go to Fürth, and then stayed in the dormitory for the time that I was there. And then coming back Friday, well, I did the reverse, get on the streetcar, go to Bahnhof, get on the train. I only got on the wrong train once. Thank goodness it was only about an hour. I got another train, got there about an hour late. My parents, of course, were frantic at that time because we had no cell phones or no way of communicating. I'll leave it there right now.
Okay, we've got everyone, but since you're on this end, why don't you go ahead and talk about what it was like to go to Nuremberg in those years you were there, and then we'll move along and have everybody go on down to the other end.
Okay, all right. My sister was about a year and a half older than I was, so when we first arrived in January of '47, she should have been already in high school, first year of high school. And she was also the only one from Regensburg at that time going to Nuremberg High School. And she was, what, that was 2 years before I went there. So, and no, just 1 year. So they sent an armed guard with her. And because it was a little bit unsettling in that no one knew exactly how safe it was going to be for dependents over there at that time, because it's all just beginning. So she was not pleased with that armed guard because she thought, there's a reason he's with me. And she didn't like that. And then the Erlang at that time was apparently just very, very rudimentary, and they had no heat at night. In the morning, she said that I tried to get her to come by what it is and let her tell her story. But a strange man would come into their room where there were 4 people, and in the morning, and light a wooden stove for heat, so they had no heat during the night. And she went 1 week, came back to Regensburg and said, I'm not going to do that. And she didn't. And so she was student the whole time, which worked out really well for her. Gosh, I don't know what story to tell first. Let me say that for a 13-year-old, I didn't understand completely what I was getting into, and the first spring that we were there, the Donau Danube River got pretty low, and you could walk along that riverbank and take your choice of your weapon of choice. Ammunition still in boxes, all kinds of weapons from all over the world were just laying there. Some of them just, had been dismantled, others had not. I had enough sense not to pick up anything that looked like it might be dangerous, but I did find it looked like an abandoned Belgian Tommy gun, probably. And the clip was gone, the bolt was gone. I thought, well, this would be sort of a nice souvenir, to take back. There's nothing dangerous about this. And I'd met several German kids there in Regensburg early on Well, I spoke a little German. By then, they spoke a little English, and we sort of communicated. But they were out in the street playing soccer when I came back up the street towards the house. Our house is up on a hill overlooking the Danube River and had a great view of Regensburg down below. So I walked up and they were playing soccer in the street, and here I had this weapon, you know, and they were younger than I were, 10 or 11, you know, and so we started talking about that, and of course I'd played Army, you know, all my childhood from World War II, and I took him with, you know. You can't believe the screams that the girl had. And she ran away. So I'm standing there, and what did I do? You know, I was just trying to play Army. And anyway, she and her brother came back in just a little bit, and the brother apologized and said, you know, she was shot, and we were strafed in our car by an American fighter, and she was shot through the back, and it entered just out below her rib cage. I don't know how she survived. And I'm thinking most of those were 50 caliber rounds. I don't know what she did. But anyway, she was very apologetic, and of course you know, I'm from Oklahoma, but I said, man, I'm not in Kansas anymore. So that was sort of the introduction, I guess, to the realities of Germany in 1947.
I'm going to talk a little bit about how the school started, because most of my classmates came over in '46 and were very early there, and among the first. But the school originally, when they first got there, was in Erlangen, and I suspect that they started the school in Erlangen, and because they had just hung the prisoners from the first trials, and they weren't sure if there was going to be some reaction or something from the German population. And so they decided, I guess, to put the school in Erlangen, where it was a little bit further away from the Nuremberg area. But the first school, according to one of my dear, dear friends who is no longer with us, he said that they had a school requisition house, and that classes were in the rooms, and they didn't have enough books, and the teachers coming over, they just had a few very basic teachers who had signed contracts to come for at least a year, and they brought their own school books with them. The students, and there usually wasn't enough seats, there were very few students. I think there was somewhere around 50 or so, and when you split them up into different classrooms, the classes were very small. And so they would sit on the floor if they didn't have chairs, and they would write what the teacher was dictating to them to study or whatever, or giving them some details about their lesson. And so they would write because they had no books, and they would have these pads. Then that only lasted a very few short weeks, and then the military took one of the rooms. Erlangen has a university, the University of Erlangen, and they requisitioned one of the buildings on the campus. And so after a very short time in that home, they moved them onto the campus. And so they had their classes there. And it was over the Christmas time of Christmas of 47, and between the 47-48 school year, they moved to Firth, and the building there in Firth was on Tannenstrasse, just off of the main drag going down Firth area. And it was originally a German girls' school prior to the war. During the war, the Germans used it for a while as a hospital and for wounded soldiers. And then very shortly after the war was over, our Army used it as a hospital very briefly. There were several buildings on this street that had been schools from kindergarten up. So the kids who were stationed in Nuremberg, they had a grade school. And then after Christmas of 47, then the senior high school was there. we had this two-story building that was for classes. Our dormitories, those of us who had fathers who were not stationed in Nuremberg, they had built two huge homes, very large mansion-type homes, about 3 blocks from the school that we were boarded in, the boys' dorm and the girls' dorm. And we had to walk the 3 miles, no matter what the weather was, we had to walk up to the school for all of our meals during the week. And in Bamberg, there was only about 8 of us or so who were senior students. And so the bus would pick us up Friday after school was over and drive us back to Bamberg. And then we would leave again on Sunday evening and back to school. We had to sign in and out. When school was over, about 3 or 3:30, I forget now, we had free time until we had to be at the school for dinner. And then we had to go back to the dorm, and we had an hour free time after dinner, and then we had a 2-hour study hall. And the first thing that happened shortly after I got there, and I started in January of '49, because we got there too late for me to get into the first semester. And we were taken to the military base movie theater and shown 2 hours of the film being used as evidence in the trials. Shortly before I got there, a number of the students were taken to to view some of the trials going on. If you've ever seen Judgment at Nuremberg, that was based on one of the very final trials. Now they took some dramatic changes to it, but and they changed the names of the people, of course. But that basically there was a final trial. The trials actually started as soon as they could get everything going, and you can't imagine. I won't go real long into it, but I was invited to the tribunal reunion here in Washington, D.C. in September of 1996, and they were celebrating the end of the first trial, which was the Nazi hierarchy. And they, actually the trials continued on. After that trial, they went to the medical trials. And then they went to the industrial trials. And they found gold teeth and all sorts of things piled in bank vaults. The bank industry was tried, basically. General Telford, Jackson, Chief Justice Jackson, left after the first trial was over, and then General Telford Taylor took over, and Drexel Sprecher took over as the chief prosecutors. The Russians pulled out right after the first trial, and that was when, shortly after that, the Berlin blockade started, and we thought we were going to war with Russia. As students, we were supposed to have a suitcase handy for a quick evacuation, and during the free hour we had after dinner, the boys and the girls could come to each other's place, and we had a downstairs. It was like a regular house, and we decided we were supposed to walk up to the school and wait for a bus to come and evacuate us. And we said, and then the motor pool was clear across the other side of town, and we were all very independent children. Our fathers were gone all through the war. We hardly knew the fathers when they came home. We weren't involved in it. We were very independent. A lot of our mothers went to work during the war, and so we were latchkey kids. And so we were pretty independent and pretty cocky. And we decided on, well, they're not going to get that darn bus over here. The Germans are going to kill every one of them and take the bus to take their own people out. So all the guys said, well, what we're gonna do is we're gonna go and we're gonna steal cars, trucks, anything. And they all knew how to hotwire, didn't you, Bill? You all knew how to hotwire. And you get it started. And then you were gonna come by the school and get the girls. The girls were to go to the school, break into the kitchen and get anything that was not gonna spoil. And since a lot of that would be canned goods, I think somebody was appointed to be sure and bring a can over. And we were supposed to put them in a blanket and tie it up and set out front and wait for these guys with the stolen cars to come and get us. Never occurred to her there were going to be millions of Germans trying to get away from the Russians too, and anybody in a car that looked American was going to get shot, killed, and everything that we had was going to be stolen. We also looked on the map, and we had two opportunities. We could either try to get to Switzerland or we could try to get to France. And we had that. Somebody was in charge of it. Don't forget the map. So anyway, we had a plan. Hey, we were going to survive. We were too far from our parents. So that was one of our evening experiences there. And being brand new to the dormitory, you know, I thought it was a hoot. We could ride free. We could ride on any German. We just flashed our dependent cards. We could ride the streetcars. The bus was free. If we wanted to go on a train, it was very cheap because it was controlled by the military. I think it cost 45 cents for me to go from Nuremberg to Bamberg. But it was an experience. I was there for 5 years. It was everything that could happen to me. Getting married. We drove through Italy. There was hardly any cars in Italy. Italy was still getting over the war. We had 3 days on Capri, and we were sitting around the only pool that was on the island at that time. And all these rich men, with yachts out in the harbor there, and they were all elderly and fat, and then their girlfriends were about 6 feet tall and wearing bikinis. The bikinis were outlawed in the U.S. at that time. And so Don and I looked at Don and I said, and they kept talking about buying and selling hotels, these men. And I said, do you think we got enough money to pay our hotel bill to get out of here? But everything was not, well, the legal rate of exchange in Nuremberg, in Germany, was about 5 Deutschmarks per dollar. But we didn't get a legal exchange. We did black market. You could sell cigarettes. You had to be 18 to get a cigarette ration, and a carton and a half in the post exchange for $1.50. But they said, well, if you're not 18, you can't have a cigarette ration. So, again, the cohorts in the dorm said, here's what we do, Kay. We go to the PX and we buy a whole box of Hershey bars for 80 cents, the whole box. And for 80 cents worth of chocolate bars, we can exchange it, sell it to the Putzfrau or the bus driver or anybody like that, any German that we came in contact with. We could sell them for anywhere from 20 to 30 Deutschmarks. Now a carton of cigarettes got up to 40 to 50 Deutschmarks. But what could we do with the Deutschmarks? The walled city was 80% destroyed. It's all been rebuilt as close to the original building, but they have better electricity and better plumbing. So, but it is a rebuilt inside. There were a few buildings that were usable, but it was pretty much damaged, and that was done by the British as retribution for the bombing of London, because Nuremberg was Hitler's favorite city, and it was going to be the world capital. Berlin would still be the country's capital, but Nuremberg was going to be the world capital. So I have a jillion stories, and I could go on and on and on. Did I leave something out? I'll let my friend Betty take over hers. And any questions that anybody has, and I have a lot of things up here you can look at after this, some pictures I have so many pictures of me up on Hitler's little platform in the stadium. So, and I've got pictures of our senior trips for several years. They brought all the seniors from all the schools, and there were only 7 schools at that time, into Wiesbaden, and we boarded a boat, and it was Hitler's river yacht. And there was a EES snack bar on board with soft drinks and ice cream and hamburgers and so forth. And we sailed up the Rhine River as far as the Lorelei. And we had a 3-piece band on board. And it was 7th of June, 1949. And it had lounge chairs, and it was a beautiful sunny day. And I got pictures of all the castles along the Rhine there. And so that was our senior trip. And we were gone all day. We boarded at 8 and didn't get back home until about 5 or 6 in the evening. And that was a senior trip on Hitler's yacht. And believe me, we were down in the engine room. We were running all over the place. The guys were playing poker for money. And of course, our money, we were not allowed to have, American money in the area. We had MPC, Military Payment Certificate. Good. And here's a nickel. Even the nickels were paper. Sort of like monopoly money. And we
Commonly
treated
referred
it.
to as script.
We treated it like.
And that's the blue issue. They had a red issue before that.
Oh, they changed the design ever so often because it was so black marketable, you know, and easily redone, made over by somebody else with a printer. And so they would, every once in a while, they'd give very short notice. You had to bring in your script and exchange it for the new script. And if you had any of this that you
What
didn't.
happened? You didn't
get to use it once they changed over to a different design. You couldn't use it. You had to exchange it, and they gave you about 3 hours to get to your headquarters and get the new script. And if you didn't make it, tough luck.
So most people kept their 5 steps.
Quick comment on the script. When they changed over from the red script to the blue script, it was in the morning they announced, everybody go home and get their script, bring it in, it's being exchanged, and they did it on a one day. However, I'd gone over to the medical depot the day before the script change, and the German guard, well, the DP guard at the gate of the medical depot showed me a counterfeit script dollar bill. The Germans had already counterfeited before they even told us they were changing it.
No lack of skills in forgery at that time.
Sounds like an inside job.
Okay, I'm going to stop. Go ahead, Ben.
Oh, well, I've just got 4 years going through my head right now.
Could you introduce yourself?
Eddie Thomas. Class of 54. I got there in 1950 and graduated in 54. But by the time I was there and he had already left, we still took the train. I lived there, my parents were in Würzburg, and we took the train to school every week. And about 1952, I think they started busing us. They couldn't handle us on that train. We had all those compartments, you know, you could close the doors, and the poor conductors, all they knew how to say was, "Where are your papers?" in English. But when I first got there, we had spent 11 days on I call it a boat. The Navy probably would get mad if they heard me. They call it a ship. But it was like this the whole trip practically. And they sent us to Bad Kissingen, which I don't think nary a bomb had dropped there. And it was gorgeous, and my mother and I'm an only child. My mother and I thought, oh man, it's going to be great. Well, you know what Würzburg was like. It was just almost entirely demolished. And Nuremberg was the same way. And I don't recall that anybody had said, when we get to Germany, Betty, you're going to have to go away to school. Nobody ever said that to me. And so we had been in Bad K, I don't know, 4 weeks, something like that. And Mother said, I've got your bags all packed. You're going away to school. And I was dumbfounded because I'd been off before, but to an aunt or an uncle or something like that. And for 3 weeks, I thought they had sent me to hell. And by the 4th week, I didn't want to go home anymore. I loved it here. And I cried for 2 months after I got home, after I graduated. I had a ball, but it was one of those things where I'm sure a lot of you have experienced the same thing being a brat. You grow up awfully fast, and by the time I got back home, I felt like I didn't fit anywhere, you know, that kind of feeling. But I was way so far advanced of all the people I knew that were 18, you know, so, but anyway. If I think of something else, I'll interrupt. I'm good at that, so go ahead.
Janet, were you there when the school opened?
I beg your pardon?
Were you there when the new school opened?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I was.
What was that like?
I was at the old school, and about Christmas break, we packed all of our stuff. We had to take everything home. And when we got back, we moved into the new dorm. And we still call it the new dorm.
And they opened the big 3-story school
Yes,
in January?
yes,
And it must have seemed
1952.
huge.
Yes. The dormitory was just the one building. It wasn't an L-shaped building, but it was just one building. Girls on one side, boys on the other, and togetherness in the middle.
Frequently.
As much as possible. Oh, and I can tell you, when you went down into the basement where you did your laundry and ironing and that kind of thing, there was a place there that had a window on the side of the basement, and you could get out if you
Of course, you didn't do that.
That was just hearsay. Oh, and the evacuation plans were still in force. 1950s. Those plans were still being talked about.
We thought you guys were all innocent, nice, well-behaved. I see not many things have changed.
My name's Jack Phillips, in case you've forgotten. I didn't stay in the dormitory. My family actually lived in a German neighborhood. I had Germans on both sides of me. It was kind of interspersed with Germans and Americans. The Germans played with. We played. There was a vacant lot across the street. We played baseball. Germans wanted to get and do that too. We were picked up every morning by a bus, a military bus that took us to the school in Firth. If you missed the bus, you could always take the streetcar. Like you say, you didn't have to flash an ID. They knew us, and we were the guys wearing jeans, and we were also the rude. I felt like really the ugly American because you were supposed to give your seat to an old lady, and we were obnoxious.
Hey, we won.
Yeah.
That's why they started using
we
the military
flaunted it.
buses instead of trains.
I remember just I was 14 and a half when I got there. The total freedom. Parents didn't worry about their kids. My mother didn't, I don't think. They went out. You took the streetcar, you went, I got a bicycle shortly after I got there. A German which looked different from the Americans' bicycles in those days had the big tires, and they were laughed at by the Germans. I got a German bicycle. I used to ride out to what we call Soldier Field, where Hitler talked. We call it Soldier's Field. I used to ride my bicycle out there. They had really nice bike paths, and all over the city. I used to go to the German movies because they were a little bit more risque than the American movies. You might see a bare breast somewhere. And although I mean, I always got A's in German, but I didn't. My conversation in German was really not very good. Let's see, what else?
Herr Kroner?
Herr Cronin?
Was he your?
Yes,
He was
Dr.
he was
Croner.
at the Nuremberg
Yeah,
School
I
for
liked
many
him.
years.
I liked him.
He was
Yeah.
a German teacher.
Yeah, he was from Hungary, I believe, but he taught German there at school for a long time.
You know, another thing,
What year were you at there?
I was class 51, so I got there in the summer of 49.
You got there after they civilized Germany.
I'm not, yeah, I guess so. You know, I don't know if this crossed my mind. There were, I guess, in downtown Nuremberg, there were no like bathrooms. Guys would urinate against a wall, a tree. I don't know what the women did, but I mean,
Yes, you do, too.
but
They didn't do it in secret either. There
anyway,
was no
I'm done for a while.
policy whatsoever.
You could see the German buses whenever they had a whole load of Germans probably going to another city, and if you were going from Nuremberg to another place, it was not uncommon to see the bus parked on the side of the road, and the women get out and run this way, and the men run that way, finding a bush or a tree.
Yes.
They just didn't have those
Some of
thoughts.
us didn't bother finding the bushes.
Yeah, if you were desperate, who cared?
In German is "Bist du jetzt dran?" That's how we say it in Nuremberg. It's your turn. My experiences are so different, so incredibly different. My dad was a head of the English department at the University of North Dakota. North Dakota being a college in the Western Plains, very small town, and everybody knew everybody else. And we got our orders. My dad had to go earlier. And we got our orders, so we went to New York City. Skyscrapers, people, cars, commotion going on. It was an interesting experience because I'd never seen a big city before. And so my mother said that, no, Dad had to go over there to help with the administrative part of the trials. And as I tell people, you had the legal side, the judges, represented by the 4 allied countries, the United States, England, France, and the Soviets. And you had the military. The military guarded the prison. They had the tanks. They had the machine guns and did all that kind of stuff and ran the barracks. Merrill Barracks there was a former SS barracks taken over by the Americans. And but there was administrative chaos. They didn't have anybody to make all these pieces work together. And I mean, who writes the reports? I mean, who does these things, puts these books together? Where do you find housing? Where do you have drivers? Where do you find personnel? Where do you find translators? And so my dad, being trained in administration, was brought over to handle the administrative part. And we were following him. And so we got on a Liberty ship, the George W. Goethals, and you know, the number of days crossing the North Atlantic in the wintertime, I was sick the entire time making it across. We went into Southampton and then reprovisioned, dropped some people off, and then we were going into Germany. And they said, well, we have to wait to pick up the German pilot to go through the minefields. And so, okay, we're going through the minefields, and then we reached Bremerhaven, and we had to wait to take the night train to go into Nuremberg because it was still dangerous. And they said, when you get on the train, do not sit by the window because there still would be people possibly shooting at you. And as a youngster, my thoughts were, what the hell's going on? They're going to shoot at us? But, you know, we slept on the train, and we came into the Nuremberg station in the morning, and I can remember the scene as if it were yesterday. And people have asked me, how come? When you see something so shocking, so different, it doesn't leave your mind. Even at my age, as I approach 77, I can remember everything that happened that day as if it were yesterday. I remember walking through this big door, the Tor there on the and walking out and seeing utter destruction. You know, technically it was called 90% destroyed, which was, and quiet, because, and I just left New York. There were no cars driving around other than Americans, and everybody was busy at the trials. It's the morning, it was a work day. And the Germans were standing around, and they looked as if they were in shock, like they had gone through an incredible experience that nobody could describe, which they had. And they just stood there, and they're mostly in dark clothing, grays and black.
Did you find everything in your memory now that was the difference between black and white photographs and color photographs?
In my
That's
mind,
how I described how I felt when I got there. I was in a black and white.
absolutely. The way the people were dressed, the cars were black, the streets were destroyed. I mean, it was so unusual. It was as if I were going into a different world, which I was. And my first thought was, my God, is this how Germans live? You know, I did not realize the full impact of being in a destroyed city. And we had a staff car. My dad was working. He always worked. If you were at the trials, you worked day and night.
Yeah.
And we got in the car. My mother was on this side, and there was the entrance area was on our right. I was in the middle. My brothers were on the left and up front. My mother was a smoker. She rolled down the window and threw the cigarette butt out the window. And I remember, once again, as if it were yesterday, all of a sudden, those zombies, those Germans standing around doing nothing, came running towards the car. And, my God, what's going to happen to us? And they were fighting for the butt.
Oh.
And this is the German culture of that time. You fight over a cigarette butt. My mother rolled up the window and we went home. If you're familiar with, some may not be, what happened is with Nuremberg. Nuremberg was Stadt der Reichsparteitage. It's the city of the Empire Party days. And in the 1920s, up until 1940, 40 was canceled because of the war, the German government, Hitler and all the top dignitaries would go to Nuremberg, and they would have their party days and their rallies and their parades through Zeppelinfeld, great big Zeppelins with the dirigibles. And it was a big, over 1 million people showed up. I thought 1 million people showed up in that little town. The logistics must have, that's another story, how they handled that. But anyway, they would come there, and so it was considered the most German of the German cities and Hitler's favorite city. Munich had its designation because that's where the party was. They had the Brown House in Munich. And in Nuremberg, the old town of Nuremberg is not very big, surrounded by a dry moat. And it was known for its beer. It was known for its toys. It was a toy center, but there was nothing else in Nuremberg. But it was considered by the Allies the most German of German cities, and it had to be destroyed. And Bomber Harris from the British command, his philosophy was, although they deny it later, but I've written proof of that if you bomb a building, it can be replaced in a couple of months. If you kill a German, it takes 20 years. So therefore, the decision during World War II was to go after civilians, which they did with alacrity. If you consider today, Our government today bends over backwards. The military is advised, don't minimize to the maximum extent possible civilian casualties because it has such undesirable consequences. Don't kill the people, the civilians. But it wasn't that way during World War II. If you look at the bombing of Berlin, there were other reasons for bombing Berlin, but they wanted to kill the people who were there. The major industrial centers, yes, get rid of the industry, but you've got to kill the people at it. And I remember the stories of the people. They didn't have school initially, which was fine for me. I could roam around the city during day and night. Nobody bothered me. Nobody bothered me. I got to know the German kids because the German kids, because of my age at the time, from the time we arrived there in November, which was immediately after Goering had committed suicide, and there's chaos in the courthouse at that time, up until January when he had school again, it was free time. So I went through the city collecting what I called my treasures. And I had a nice house that my dad had taken over, and had a big bedroom, and it was full of stuff. Because it was, as you say, it was lying around. Rifles, pistols, helmets, gas masks. Because what happened is I have a picture of it. You can't look at the book, but you can see what Nuremberg looked like. What the American military did is they went with their bulldozers and went through the streets and pushed all the war debris onto the sidewalks. And that's where all the treasures were. And I collected the stuff. My dad didn't bother me. He was busy, so I had my bedroom full of these things. And what was amazing is there was a recreation center that was taken over called Linda Stadium.
Yes.
And it was so nice. They had an ice skating rink, had a nice pool, they had an exchange. It was a marvelous place to be. And they had a door prize. They really were trying to make this as attractive as possible for the families. My door prize was a Nazi battle banner. And I think of it in later days. That was a door prize for American kids. And so I went home and I put the banner on my wall. And in 1947, the weather was warming up and we had a nice little balcony, so I opened up the door. And they had German police. They had, at that time also, and a German policeman came by and looked at that banner. Was hat drauf? Was hat gemacht? And I came down and, Deine? Ja, I shouldn't say it. I should speak in English. I'm sorry. Is that yours? Yes, it's mine. Take it down. No. Hast du mich? Did you hear me? Take it. 9. I could speak German at that time. At that age, in those few months, I was starting to forget English, and I could speak German. It was a child's German, but I could speak German. And so I knew all the German kids around there. Fortunately, meine Gouvernante, my governess, was in the house at the time and said, he's an American. And the German policeman said, well, I should stop because I'm starting to speak in German. He can't be a German. He speaks German. Or he can't be an American. He speaks German. And when my father came home, he said, take it down. Which I did. But when you look at in Nuremberg, during the war, what happened is the bombers, of course, were coming in from the west. When they got over Fürth, which was not badly destroyed or damaged, they started releasing the bombs. They were not as accurate as they are today. They didn't have smart bombs or anything. So part of Fürth, especially around the Palace of Justice, did get some bombing, no question about it. But if you look at the edge of the old walled city of Nuremberg, that's why it's 90% destroyed. Now, beyond the old walled city, of course, some of the bombs were a little bit further than that, and they were up to that expropriated house when we were in. It was amazing. You know, where we were in Erlenstiegen, it wasn't bombed. But I went less than a block away and it was flat. And so when the Americans arrived, it wasn't like we had a compound that we could go to. Later on, they had a place where you could go and you could stay and so on. So what we did is, part of my job, or my dad's job, is he went around the community locating housing. And it was here, there, and thother throughout the German community. So that's why we were in basically the German community. And a little further behind us in Erlenstiegen were the witness houses, if you're familiar with the witness houses. And those were homes that were taken all over for all the witnesses who attended the Nuremberg trials. And they weren't too very far from where we were. And so because I had all this free time, I would walk around, and I could speak German very quickly at a young age. They would tell me what it was like during the war, and the running to the bomb shelters, and the screaming and the hollering that would go on. And one guy said, you cannot imagine what it was like. He was late getting to the bomb shelter. He was in the house. And I should back up a minute. There were 3 bomb alerts for the towns of Germany. The first one says the bombers are crossing the English Channel. The second one says they're kind of directing towards Nuremberg. And the third one says, you better be in the shelter now. And one guy told me he was late. And he says, you cannot imagine what it was like as he is running through the streets and the bombers are covering the horizon from one horizon to the other, because they would be launching in some of those attacks with over 1,000 bombers. And Nuremberg is a little city. 1,000 bombers, and they're circulating, coming over and dropping. And they would run in, and he would get to the closest bunker and go underneath ground. And the people were screaming, and the kids are crying, and they have to stay there during the bombings. So as we moved later on into Germany, I found out what starving is like. I see people starving. I went out in December of 1946, and I went by a bombed area, and the only thing left of the entire complex was the threshold of a door. And a man is leaning against it. And 1946, December, was a very cold, miserable winter. And why is this guy leaning against a Schwelle, a doorway? He was leaning there, and as I got closer to him, I realized he was dead. He was frozen. And so it scared me. It scared me. So I said, I'm going to go into town and look for some more treasures. So as a consequence, and I have to cut this off because, like Joan, I could talk all day long, I developed an enormous sympathy for what I saw and what I endured and what I saw among the Germans. I did not suffer from what the Germans did. And I heard their stories of when the soldiers would come back after the war, and they'd been kept in prison camps in Russia and forced labor camps. And because I could speak German, and because I didn't know what the Germans had done during World War II, I just saw a tremendous suffering. And because I didn't harbor any animosity towards the Germans, they would tell me their stories. And I was fascinated by them, because I was desperately trying to find out, what the hell happened? How could this be? How could people live like this? Why does these things happen? And as a consequence of all those experiences, I can say, like others, it has made an impression on my entire life. My entire life. Nothing it was as strong in my life as that experience of being there after the war and seeing the suffering. Now, when I came back to the United States, as you say, it's a wholly different society. And I heard about anti-German stuff. Wait a minute, are you talking about the people that I lived among? Oh yeah, these are terrible, horrible people. And then, as I included in my book, I found out more about the directives that the Americans had at that time. He said, and I had to stop it. Die sind schreckliche Leute, die müssen bestraft werden. These are terrible people and they must be punished, was the guidance that we had at the trials. You never hear that today, but that was the guidance we had. And you are not to feed them. And he said, they may be starving, but you can't feed them. Americans are not that way. And so when the Germans came to the house, we said, take some food home with you. We gave them cigarettes because they needed it for the black market to survive. It was basic survival for them.
Did you have a housekeeper?
Yes.
Well, we had a housekeeper who, after all these years, I had such a soft spot in my heart for her because she took me in and treated me as though I were a relative of hers. And I can remember so many things about her. She was a young woman. As it turns out, she was not much more in age than I was at the time. I found her about maybe 10 years ago. And when we went
Just
back
before
to Germany,
2001.
they met us at the little cruise boat we were on, and I spent the day with her. She couldn't speak English anymore, but she remembered my dog's name and all these things about me and my family. She took me to the German opera back in the day, and took me to German movies, and I could never, why would we be mad at somebody like her?
Yeah.
Her husband sent me a picture of her when she was in the German Air Force. And she's standing on these steps, and all these people in their uniforms, and the German guys in their black uniforms with their boots up to their knees, you know, and I'm thinking, that can't be Rita, but it surely was, because you can pick her out of that picture. But that was one of my, a wake-up thing, or not a call, but a wake-up. These are human beings. When I got there, I was afraid of all of them. But after I met her, it just changed my whole attitude about that. I'm sorry.
Now, I'm glad you added that, because I had the same feeling.
I'd like to add
Please.
there too, because I know Joan had the same experience you've written about this. That those of us that attended the Nuremberg trials, one of the striking things about it was that we really couldn't tell the difference between the people who were on trial. They just looked like you and I. And a lot of them were. I mean, they just got caught up in this system that did not do well for them. But one of the things that was so absolutely profound to me was that I, at a pretty early age, could not tell the difference between the American patriotism and the American racial discrimination than that of the Germans. Emotionally, it was the same thing. And that has stayed with me so strongly, for all of my life. And I've been searching for answers to that and trying to understand that. And it's not an easy thing to understand.
If I could break in here, we have a service announcement here.
All right. My wife and I are decorating for the ball this evening, and so if you would like to help out doing the decorations, 1 o'clock or so after this meeting, if you would, we're up in the mezzanine, and as you get off the elevator, you go to your left, and to your left, it's the Tyson Ballroom, and so we would sure be glad to have any of you that'd like to volunteer. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Well, we really don't have much time, but let me just finish up with, as far as the trials, that's a whole other conversation. And when I came back to the United States, I spent a lifetime trying to figure out what happened.
Yeah.
Why did this happen the way it did? When I was at the University of Maryland, I heard about an excellent history professor by the name of Gordon Prang. And he was in Berlin in the late 30s. He attended the rallies. He was studying there at the university. And near the end of the war, he was in intelligence. And after the war, he was sent to Japan to interview all the top military leaders there. And he wrote many books, including one which was made into an American movie called Tora, Tora, Tora. And so he started me on this process of what happened. Why did the Germans do what they did? And was anything they did unusual? And if you take a history course, you will find many similarities. You bring up racial discrimination that we had. And I can tell you what it was like in this, from my own experience and my family's experience of the discrimination against Jews in this country. My wife's family escaped before the Holocaust, came to this country, and as Jews living in the United States, it was pretty tough. And the discrimination was very, very heavy. But today, it's not known. Nobody knows the history of that time period.
So it's all sort of different in where you grew up and how you grew up. Now, I'm basically a good Southern boy. I was born in Charleston, South Carolina, and grew up at Fort Moultrie, South Carolina. And those of you that know anything about history know that's where the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter to start the Civil War. But I grew up an Army brat. I was born into the infantry and grew up in the military my entire life. As a little kid, my chores around the house was to take my father and my grandfather's brass off their uniforms every Friday and polish it, put it back on the uniform so they could pass Saturday inspection. So my life experience is a whole lot different than people that grew up as civilians in civilian areas. And they talk about the discrimination, and that discrimination against Germans. Most people don't know it, but in the 20s, there were riots in Louisville, Kentucky, between the English-speaking population and the German immigrants. They were pretty much divided, and there were wars that took place. I mean, big riots took place in Louisville, Kentucky, between the Germans and the English-speaking people in the town. Now, my wife's family were good German-speaking people from Louisville, but that discrimination depends on where you were and who was being discriminated against. As a kid, I grew up the Army brat, moving around, moving into these small southern towns, and I was always the outsider. I was discriminated against as much as anybody around.
Yeah.
Because every time I moved to a new town, I had to find my place in the pecking order in that civil society. And people that grew up my age, finding your place in the pecking order meant you had to fight every boy in town until you found out which ones you could beat and which ones could beat you. And that established where you were. I learned real quick to do it the easy way. I would watch and see who the ringleader was in the neighborhood, and I would make myself available, and I'd fight the ringleader first. That way I could work my way down to my position. And I was taught unarmed combat for the infantry soldier when I was 7. So by the time I was 10, I could kill you 12 ways barehanded. But at any rate, I only had to fight 1 or 2 guys in each neighborhood because I started at the top and worked my way down and didn't go down very far.
Bill, when you got to Nuremberg, how many did you have to fight there?
Well, by the time I got to Nuremberg, I was 15, and I learned enough to be careful, because at the time I got there, June of 1947, there were still German gangs wandering through the countryside, and they were nicknamed werewolves. And if you were out in the countryside by yourself, you might not make it back to home, because those gangs of werewolves out in the countryside, they'd beat you to a pulp or kill you. Didn't matter to them, because kids my age in Germany were combat veterans. At the end of World War II, kids as young as 10 years old was being conscripted into the German infantry. And so they grew up as combat soldiers. They had shot at people and been shot at. So killing you didn't seem to bother them. But
I want you to tell the story about
how the Nuremberg, about the school colors and the
Oh,
football team. I
yeah.
want you to tell that story because I'm sure there's a lot of people here that have never heard it.
Yeah, very, very quickly. I got to Germany in June of 1947. At that time, Erlangen High School was still in session. They didn't get out until later on in the late in the month of June, because the winter of 46, 47 was a really harsh winter in Germany, and they didn't have school a lot of times, so to cover all the material, they went well into the month of June. But I wandered around Germany for 3 months during that summer before I even met another American kid. I traveled Germany in a Jeep with a Special Services sergeant, but we went off on scrounge missions. But at any rate, when we started school there in Nuremberg on Tannenstrasse, that was the first year of Nuremberg High School in Nuremberg. Previously it had been at the University of Erlangen, up in Erlangen. But at the beginning of the school, there were about 60 of us in the high school. That's in the entire high school. So boys, of course, wanted to play football. The school said there's not enough of it. So the school system refused to sponsor a football team. So because of the relationships in the school, some of the kids' fathers was in charge of special services, some of them with the MPs, some of them with transportation. They were from all different parts of the military around there. The kids got together and we formed our own football team. One of the boys' father managed to get us football uniforms. That's how the school colors became red and white. Because the only football jerseys available to us were red. Well, they said the school colors are supposed to be green. They said, no, we got red football uniforms. So the students took a vote that they would change the school colors to red and white, because we had red jerseys and white breeches. So that's how we got red and white. And of course, we were from all over the United States, and everybody had a favorite football team back home, and some of them wanted to name the team Bulldogs, others wanted to call them Ponies and one thing or another. But through one of the contacts, we had the Coca-Cola representative in Nuremberg had played a couple of years of professional football, and they talked Schneider into coaching us kids in the high school. He was offered a paid job to coach the Nuremberg military post football team, and he turned down that opportunity for a paid job to coach us kids. And we were known all over the American zone as Snyder's boys. We'd run into another American kid, they'd say, well, what school are you from? We said, we're Snyder's boys. Oh, you're from Nuremberg. But there were only 20 of us out to play football, and everybody had their own favorite team. And we went out to Soldiers Field, or the Zeppelin's Platz, depends on which name you wanted to call it by. And we had a practice field furnished to us out there. And we got out there one day, and Schneider got us into a circle and says, I've heard all these arguments about somebody wants to call the team Bulldogs, somebody wants to call it Ponies, but you're Tigers. Remember that, you're Tigers. And that was before the days when being a Tiger became a popular thing during the Korean conflict. But Nuremberg football team was the Nuremberg Tigers, and our colors were red and white. Now, originally it was supposed to be set up as green and white because the color of the clover leaf on the Firth flag was a green clover leaf, and Nuremberg colors included the eagle, so they were supposed to be Nuremberg Eagles, green and white. But we were, as Joan says, quite independent.
Well,
So this-
eventually they did go back to the eagle because that's on the Nuremberg crest.
But we became red and white because that was the football jersey color we had. We became the Nuremberg Tigers because Coach Snyder said, "You're Tigers."
Bill, I think we're going to have to wind this up pretty soon. I have some things up here. This was one of my classmates, and his uncle kept all his letters, and the Kale family arrived in '46. It was a large family, and several of the brothers, 3 of the brothers were in school, and the older daughter was class of '48. Bud was class of '49, the next brother was class of '50, but they all left it the summer of '49 after being there for 3 years. But the letters that they sent home were very detailed about what it was like and in Germany at that time during those first years. I also, I don't know if you all have heard of this. Donna Musel put this together. It's an excellent film, and I have some cards here. If you don't have one and would like to get one, if you contact them on one of these cards, they'll be happy to send it to you. They aren't real expensive.
The letters from home is available on Amazon.
Yeah.
I'd like to have Gary be able to talk just a little.
But I've got a quick secret. I will let you all know. The General Rickard was in charge of all the military police in the beginning, and eventually he came, after the trials were over, he came over and he became commanding officer of the UCOM, which handled EES and all sorts of other things in the Palace of Justice. It became a military headquarters. But he was in Frankfurt, Germany first, as that was where the MP commanding officer was. After the men were hung from the first trial, they were cremated. And they were sent to a crematorium in Frankfurt, Germany. And General Telford Taylor and an assistant, I don't know, it may have been his, the officer that was his aide, and they went to get the ashes. They were given to the Frankfurt crematorium under fake names. They got the ashes, and very late in the middle of the night, they took them down and dumped them in a river, and probably the Rhine, because Frankfurt sits right on the Rhine. And so they dumped them in the Rhine, mainly so the families could not demand the ashes, could not bury them, could not put monuments to them. And so that is what happened to the bodies. And I told this to Drexel Sprecher, who was one of the top prosecutors whenever I came to their reunion in '96. I said, "Do you all know what happened to the bodies after they were hung?" And he said, "No, we don't. They never told us anything." And I said, "Well, I know." His son, Jick Rickard, told me his father never told him this until about 2 years before he died. And so Jick told me at one of our meetings, his son was James Rickard, but everybody called him Jick. He lives up in Traverse City, Michigan. And so he told me this at one of our Golden Oldie reunions several years ago. And I was so delighted. Of course, I knew it in '96, and so I was had so much fun telling Drex what happened to the bodies, because not everybody knows that. I also got to go to Vienna Vienna, Austria was a 4-power country too. It was all split up as well. And I went to Vienna in 1952, and you had to go catch the train down to Strasbourg, Salzburg, and then they put you on a night train. The Russians would only allow us to go through there, because Vienna was in the center, just like Berlin was. And so you had to travel only at night. And I think it only takes you about 2 hours or so to drive it from Vienna to Salzburg. And it took us all night. the Russians only allowed them to go about 10 kilometers per hour, and every so often, so many kilometers, they would stop us. We had 2 MPs on each end of the car, armed, and they would have all our papers and our passports or our travel authority papers from our offices, and they would have to show them to somebody. And we were told not to raise we had sleeper cars, and we were told not to raise the shade on the window if they saw the shade open, and do not turn the lights on at night. And if they saw the shades open, they would stop and invade the car, and somebody was spying, and so we had to be very careful. But we found, I went with one of the girls I worked with, we found that the shade didn't go all the way up to the window. It was open about a half an inch maybe. And if we pressed our cheek against the side of the car and looked through this little crack, we could see soldiers marching up and down all across the tracks, all the way. And we left about 8 or 9 o'clock at night. We did not get into Vienna until 8 o'clock in the morning because of all the stops and then the slow thing. But we peaked, but it was an interesting trip. And once you got into Vienna, it was lovely. We just couldn't go into the Russian sector. And the big Ferris wheel, that is a symbol, you see that when they advertise Vienna all the time. The big Ferris wheel was in the Russian sector, and we couldn't go into that area, and it wasn't working anyway. But that was very similar to what people went through going into Berlin as well.
2 years before that, I got to ride on that Ferris wheel. Took a baseball trip into Vienna.
All right.
Well, the gentleman on the end there.
I'd love to give Gary a chance, since he has such an unusual story to tell, having spent the war, being there during the war.
Thank you. I was over in Nuremberg in 49-50. My name's Gary Grassel, and I'm surprised you didn't recruit the girls for your football team. Basically, well, I was an American citizen in Germany, and we had to travel to Munich because it would put pressure on my mother to make me German, which she refused to do. And then I was in this German gymnasium, so I think, and the teacher asked each person a name and where were you born. And that was kind of iffy for me. I was in the last row, so I decided I'm going to lie. I'm going to say I was born in that little village where I came from. But then it was my turn, and I realized if I lied, I was in worse trouble. So I said quickly, Omaha, Nebraska, hoping she wouldn't know where I was. And she said, oh, we have a little American here. It was okay. Well, the bombings was kind of fun at first because in the middle of math class, I had to run out. There were trenches, and you could look down on this giant airfield, and once in a while some German fighters went up against the sky full of American flying fortresses. But once we had to go down into the basement, and this school was filmed in a movie, The Bridge, if you've seen that, that was our school. And that was very crowded, and I really hated that. And all of a sudden the whole thing shook like an earthquake, like the whole place was moving and noisy. And the principal told us to lie down on the concrete. And he went down really fast, so I knew he was scared. I was scared. So then after a while, I realized I had to do something because I was going to go crazy from this terror. Something crazy. So I was lying next to this guy, and I told him when I was home last time what my aunt had cooked. Crazy stuff. And he looked at me, the whole night, he looked at me as if I was crazy, but he kept me from going insane completely. I do have post-traumatic stress disorder from that bombing. And then we had to go, and night we had to go into a church. It was kind of eerie. It was just a little green light from the red light. So always there was a catafalque in front of the altar, and I was always wondering, there's a body inside. So then that evening after the bombing, there was all these planes coming, many, and they were all allies, you could tell from the sound. Now I had time to get scared. So I started to pray. I was in the church, I was in the 5th grade. But I didn't pray to God. I prayed to the pilots. I really thought I was talking to them. Now I thought, it's supposed to be an American, never done me any good, but maybe I can use it here. So I talked to them and told them, don't drop your bombs on me. I'm an American like you. He was crazy. Of course, it was like a regression. When the GIs hit, he calls for his mother, who may be 1,000 miles away. But this kind of thing, I went back to early childhood. And they did not drop their bombs, although I found out later they were British, of course, at night. So the war was fighting in some ways. We could see the cities burning in the distance. We were in the mountains, so some of the refugees said, this is Munich, this is Regensburg, and so on. They knew where the city was. You couldn't actually see the city, but you saw the fire, the flames were reflected in the clouds, in the dust that was in the clouds. So once there was brilliant at night, it was just like now, and I think a bomb was exploded. Well, when there was some German troops there, our house was headquarters, and the lieutenant said, this is the best place for defense. I can cover the whole valley from our house. Great. And then my mother was trying to talk him out of it. And then she said, he said, I'm never going to give up. I'm going to fight in the mountains. My mother said, oh, that's great. I'll bring you your lunch. And there was another lieutenant who was trying to make friends with a refugee girl, and she was up on the 2nd floor. And they were talking. And he complained that the German girls are already dating the Americans, and we're still fighting them. How we knew this, I don't know. So my mother was taking us out of the field of fire, so we passed this German soldiers, and I said, this was an instance of bravery. I said loud to them, why don't they leave? Nobody wants to get out of here. And there was an old man there, one of the soldiers. And they finally left, and the lieutenant said, I want to listen to the news, and I'll take him out of here. He was doing as a favor, I said, sure. And the news was that the Americans and the Russians were going to get into a fight very soon. And if we're going to leave with the Germans, we're going to win after all. So then school was out, and we were at the entrance to the village. There were a lot of German trucks coming by. Then there was nobody. I saw this little plane in the distance. And there was this little snub-nosed vehicle coming toward us. And I was seeing black sticking out. My eyesight wasn't so good, but it looked to me like a SS giving the Hitler salute. But then it turned around, it turned out to be a heavy machine gun pointing at us. So now this old soldier was down, he had deserted. He was building himself a little hut from the wood. This was like a mill yard. But he had bad luck that he came just at that moment, and the Americans put him on the bumper. Now, I didn't see this because when I saw the white star, I got crazy and I just ran. Tell about the Americaners in here. So that was a crowning moment for me. But Werner, who was a little bit more calm, he said, the Americans put this soldier on the hood of the Jeep for protection, and then they were all ambushed by SS further down. I didn't see, but that's what he said. He was pretty reliable. He was an older kid. But that was, well, of course, also we went for the ammunition, but the German soldiers threw their arms were always in ditches, and then we dove in after that to get what was there. But we wanted the ammunition cartridges because we made firecrackers from the cartridges. But that was what Harold had a whole arsenal of ammunition that could have equipped the whole platoon, but I didn't leave it either. So anyway, that was then. I was in 46. I was at Augsburg elementary school when it just started, and that was kind of fun. Our school bus was a three-quarter ton, which was great fun. So I was there. It was the first time in English school. The only problem I had was the metric system and the American system. What was a period in one, was a comma in the other, what was a comma in one, what was a period in the other. I just had a little time to figure that out, but it was okay. They had this funny ball which bounced all different crazy ways.
How did you end up at going back to the American school? What did your father came back to Germany and
Right.
where you and your mother were, and what, did he work for the army, or was he in the military?
Yeah, he came to Germany. He was in the American Army. He was regular Army. And so he took me to Augsburg. It was a little bit learning experience because the first day there, all the kids were running around, chasing each other around the room. And the teacher whom I had met before was German said, I can't do anything with these kids. Help me to sit down. Of course, they just laughed at me. In the German school, you sat, and then when the teacher came, you stood up, and then he told you to sit down. It was a little bit different. And then the dorm father, he was trying to convince us to be nice to him. Like, I give you a fair deal if you give me a square deal. He was negotiating with us. That was absolutely crazy to me. In Germany, you had told them, didn't ask him. So anyway, I guess that's the. And when I was now school in German school, our school uniform was brown shirts. They just you didn't have any choice. But one teacher, he was angry at us for wearing the uniform in the school. He said, I don't want you to wear the uniform anymore. Now I know now if you turned him in, he would have been killed. But one of the guys, he was kind of apologetic. He said, well, we have military training right after school. But we don't have time to go to the dorm to change, so that's why we have to wear all day here. And that was it. Nobody turned them in as far as I know, but that was basically all the Germans could do to make an emotional gesture which could have gotten them killed, which had absolutely no effect on the situation. He was typifying to me what Germans could do, basically nothing. So that's basically it.
I have a
Thank you.
And one comment I'd like to make relative to him talking about the discipline in the school. When I first got to Germany, they had a GAY organization. It was German American Youth. They were trying to mix the German youth with the American youth so they could learn each other's cultures. Well, we had a group from the German school come to visit Nuremberg, and they were absolutely astounded by the chaos in our classrooms. Because in the German school, they sat down in their desk and they sat at attention, and they didn't speak, didn't look to one side or the other unless the teacher called on them. Then they stepped out of the desk, stood up at attention, answered the question, and then sat back down. They were very, very strictly disciplined in those schools. And they couldn't believe all the chaos that went on in our classrooms because the teachers got no respect.
I have a question. Do any of you remember moving into the housing area when it was completed?
Yes. My husband and I were in Dambach. We had when we first married. These were the requisition houses, and they didn't start building those big apartment buildings until about 1950-51 as part of the Marshall Plan. And of course, so as they finished, they would take us out of the requisition houses and move us into them. And we had a brand spanking new apartment on the first floor, and my child was born shortly after they moved us. And so we had brand new furniture. I mean, we had a 12-place setting of Rosenthal china. And I mean, all you had to do was have sheets and your clothes and a few towels for the bathroom. And
you got 25% breakage a year.
Yes, and if you take damage, you paid for when they checked on you, when you were ready to check out.
And it was the same way in Ortsburg.
Yeah.
Joan mentioned a brand new set of Rosenthal china. When I got there in '48, they would arrange tours for Americans to go see the different German factories and that. And one of the tours out of Nuremberg would take you to a china factory. And you could walk in there, watch the way they made the china, and at the end of the line you could order whatever chinaware you wanted, and they would stamp the name on the bottom. All of the china was the same, made on the same production line. The only difference was the name that they stamped on, and that changed the price. Rosenthal was the most expensive.
And you had trouble getting it home because you didn't have all that household allowance there.
What amazes me is that you actually like the Germans. That's amazing to me because I'm still in 1950. There was definite animosity with the Germans. Everyone never called only Krauts. The boys called them Krauts, no other word. And we had a stone throwing battle in Schweinfurt once. And the chief of the MPs, the boy brought back brass knuckles, and he beat up one of the two German boys pretty badly. So there was this animosity. So then I had to decide if I was a Kraut or not, because I did not want to be called a Kraut. But this was really important because it's really important what your fellow students think of you. So I decided, well, I was in the United States only for 7 months, so I would probably be a Kraut to them. So I made up a story that I had always lived in the States. I picked this little town where my grandparents and great-grandparents had immigrated to. I knew a little bit about it in Albany, Michigan. So that became my town. And if you look in this book, this is 40. I have the wrong town in here because I was taking on this persona of an American, which was not easy to do. Okay, end of story.
Okay, we have several people have some questions.
Yeah.
Okay, John Carbone, class of '82. By the way, this is incredible. I just want to say it for everybody in the room. And I'd be willing to bet there's 1,000 other stories that are all going to play into everything that you said.
Oh, you got time?
I got plenty of time, these next few days for sure. But actually, I wrote a bunch of things down that you said that I thought, I'm just going to go through the list of little things I had wanted to ask. So the first thing that I noticed at the very beginning of the conversation was that, and I was talking to Jean about this, was that you guys actually came over on a boat.
Yeah.
I mean, I sat down and said, they came over on a boat. We all flew there, but they came over on a boat. So that would actually be kind of an interesting thing to hear about a little bit too, because all of that has to be a lot different than the way we got there.
Willerday Holbrook.
Yeah, right, or hopping across. I mean, even in '71 when I went for the, I'm actually, my mom's German. My grandmother grew up during Nuremberg during the war also, so I got a few stories there as well. But long story short, let me ask the questions though, because that's why you guys are here. So one of the things that I was trying to get a perspective of was, and one of you said it, that there were 60 students one of the years, and I was trying to figure out how many, in the very beginning, how many students were actually there when it started in 1946?
It was a small group. I'd say the first ones.
Maybe a dozen or so.
A dozen.
All they had to earn on it.
In '47, I was the only student in the 8th grade.
1947-48 school year in Nuremberg, we reached a peak of 65 students in the high school. The 48-49 school year, we reached a peak of 85 students in Nuremberg High School.
Wow.
Yeah, less than 100 for 4 grades, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade.
But an important point to add here is that when the London Act came out, all the defendants at the trials were obviously guilty because they wrote it up that they were guilty. They did everything that would classify them as guilty. As a consequence, when the trials began on the 20th of November 1945, they expected it was going to be over in a short time. So there was no need to bring the dependents over. It wasn't until they got into early 1946 and they decided they wanted to bring a lot more defendants before the court that they said, well, they've been away from their family a lot. And at Christmas time, 1945, many of the Americans at the trials had had it. They were tired of living in a bombed-out town. They hadn't seen their family in month after month, so they left. So as they moved into 1946, there was a lot of chaos because people were just tired of it.
Bob tells it a little different than I heard it as a kid. The expression that I heard when they started the whole thing was, let's try the guilty bastards, then hang them.
Right? That's the way it was. They were obviously guilty. And the Yalta Conference determined that even though a German person, part of the regime, had committed no direct atrocities, had done nothing more than been part of the regime, they were guilty. Which meant that anyone they brought before the tribunal at Nuremberg was guilty by definition.
Incidentally, we went on a field trip to the Nuremberg trials, and
Yeah.
remember that.
Yeah, they did that quite frequently in the beginning.
But what the Germans did afterwards is, in compensation for the fact that people got tired by 1949, they're finished with the trials, is they had Spruchkammern, which were the people's courts, if you will, and the Germans tried hundreds of thousands of other Germans for their contribution to the war effort.
That was what our field trip was, to see that.
So the other question, and just a small add-on to that, was how many teachers were actually there in the very beginning, and I'm sure it grew. And I was going to give you a perspective, because in 1980, when Nuremberg was at its absolute largest that the school ever was, it was actually the equivalent of what we call in Texas a 5A school, which is huge. And actually they split it up into 3 high schools. They built Bamberg High School and Bielseck.
Yeah.
And then we actually dropped down to a 3A school. So we had, in my graduating class in 1982, the graduating class was close to 150 people.
Oh, wow.
So just to put that in perspective from
Right.
and that was after they broke it up.
I had the pleasure of attending the graduation in 1969, and there were 110 graduates
Yeah.
out of Nuremberg High School that year.
Wow, that's a lot.
We're 26 and 76.
We had 105.
We had 23.
We had 58.
I only located 17. 9 have died so far that I know of. And 5 people I found weren't interested in reminiscing and joining. And so there's not too many of us left. And the very few of us that from 49 that are left, they just can't travel anymore because of major illnesses and problems. And so I'll be 83 in December.
1947.
I have to come on a journey in 2017. Will you all push me around?
1947 school year, we had 6 seniors. There were 4 girls and 2 boys. We had 4 of them graduate. So that year they had 4 graduates. I think they went off to Munich, I believe it was,
No,
for
there
the
were about
graduation.
5 of them in our class, Bill, that were supposed to graduate in 48, but they needed 1 or 2 credits.
Yeah.
And so they had to go another year.
I wanted to say that when we were in Firth in the old school, we had dormitories just down the street. One house was for boys, one house was for girls.
Yeah.
The year I got there in 1950, there were so many freshmen that that one room had like 6 double-decker beds in it. So they requisitioned, that's nice word, the house across the street and moved all the freshmen over there. So then we had 3 dorms, and then at 52 we moved.
In 1980, we had close to 400 plus kids in the dormitory.
Well,
How many room mothers?
Integrating Nuremberg High School, maybe you didn't know that.
How many room mothers did you have?
So what was that?
How many room mothers did you have?
Oh, I had no idea. I wasn't in the dorm. I
Oh.
just knew that there were that many kids that didn't want to go, because otherwise they'd be bused, right? They'd have to bus in. every day.
We just had two, one for the boys and one for the girls.
Well, that's what happened once they broke the schools up.
Do we have some more questions?
Go ahead.
Where? Yeah.
We had just a handful, but we did have a distinct handful of international students. Now, I was there 59, 62. Anybody remember any earlier?
Oh, yeah, in 47, 48, I guess probably a third of the school were international students, because we had all of the dependents of the people who were working in the war crimes trials that were English speaking. They came to our school because the German schools weren't really organized, but they liked our school. The kids liked it because we weren't as disciplined as we were as the German schools were.
Yeah, I've often wondered how many people, like my sister, just refused to actually attend the schools when they had to travel. Is anyone aware of it?
I don't know, but my mother and dad said, you behave yourself or we'll jerk you out of that school and put you in a German school.
My high school girlfriend, my senior year, was Margie Thompson. Her father was a finance officer, post-finance. But they got over there and she attended Erlangen School. And the school was so bad at that time that her parents sent her to a boarding school in England the following year. And then the school improved considerably, so they let her go to the school in Nuremberg in the 48, 49 school year. And that was a big change. People had choices where they could go, what school to attend, but it was a small thing. 47, 48 on Tannenstrasse, our desks were folding wooden Army field tables, and the chairs were all folding wooden chairs, and they were dynamiting a bunker across the intersection in the park. And every time they'd set off a dynamite charge to blow the walls in that bunker, their chairs bounced off the floor. They'd hit, window panes would fall out of the windows, the tiles would fall off the roof. So when they blew out all the interior walls of the bunker, and then when they started to blow the roof, which was much thicker steel reinforced concrete, they decided it was too dangerous, so they closed the school for 2 weeks while they finished destroying that bunker. And went back, they were still putting windows back and tiles back on the roof. But when the kids got tired of studying, the discipline in the school was great. Somebody would find a roll of 35 millimeter film, and they would roll it up real tight, wrap it with a piece of paper, and stand up on the 3rd floor, light the paper, and drop it down the stairwell. Well, that film would start to smolder inside of that burning paper, and it put out a terrible stinky smoke. So they would have to dismiss the school while they ventilated the smoke out of the inside of the building.
Getting back to the walled city, the old city, there were displaced people all over the place who had no country to return to and had lost all their family. And they were also in desperate need. But there were people going down into the old moat ditch. It's just a ditch now with grass, but it used to be a moat. They would find scraps of wood, metal, whatever, and build a little cottage down into the moat. And of course they wouldn't have heat, they wouldn't have water, but they were just trying to stay out of the cold weather. And being down in the moat would prevent wind, the cold wind from bothering them. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Eugene Jackson, class of '83. Just like John said, I want to thank you all for what you're doing today. The history lesson is phenomenal. It's awesome. I mean, everything that you are talking about resonates. My question, I guess, would be either to the panel here or to someone that's in charge. Will we have an opportunity to hear some of these stories again? And I'm telling you, it's so powerful sitting here listening to what we were basically founded on, your history there. To be able to just go back on the internet or somewhere to see that again would be powerful. Even if you're at your homes and someone can videotape it, great, you've got that. Always someone videoing, whether it's anyway, that's my appreciation for what you're doing. So my question
Eugene,
is.
I can tell you this, I've committed to one more term, and my object is to get a lot of content on the new website, and this will be one of the things that we'll put
Yeah,
on.
I've got my phone up there.
One thing, if I could add, I wrote this for my grandchildren and the relatives of the German families that I knew when I was there. I can't even give it to you. I can't even, I only show a picture of a mutual friend that I have in my book. And the reason is the German family has asked me not to publish it, because it is still the era, the Hitler era is so sensitive, even today in Germany, that they're afraid of repercussions. But I mean, I wrote the book, it's 244 pages, but I can't give it out.
Has anybody gone back to Nuremberg and seen the Congress Hall Museum?
Yeah.
If you go there, go to see that. It is absolutely
Congress
breathtaking.
Hall
Congress Hall.
has been finished, and it is now an absolutely marvelous museum. Betty and I were back in 2007, and
great.
It took us 3 hours to go through it, and they did not
They didn't
moralize
back- they didn't
Hitler.
back away
They
from
told
any
it
of that.
like it is.
Was.
It's a beautiful museum.
But it's, if
They
you
pull
go there,
no
it's
punches.
called the DOCO, D-O-C-O Zentrum, Dokumentationszentrum.
That
And
buil-
here is what
That building-
the stadium looked like when we were there. Now, all the posts are gone,
I know, it's unrecognizable.
but this is what it was like.
Yeah.
It's
That
unrecognizable.
building
We had our
that she's
state
referring
parades
to,
out there.
they finished building, when I got there in 47, that was a field full of building stones that had been cut and carved and numbered and ready to build the Congress Hall, and it sat near the Zeppelin plots out in that part of Nuremberg.
Yeah.
And we wandered through there and saw all those cut stones and the markings on them. They had everyone cut and numbered and marked, ready to stack them up to build the place. But it was sitting in a field.
There's a question back over there.
Well, it's for, kind of question, Mr. Gary. I understand you're a writer, and I wondered if you published books about your experiences in Germany or...
Are you speaking to?
Or,
To Bill?
Gary.
So I
Jerry.
wrote for this meeting, 22 page account of my experience, but the printer didn't work, so I couldn't bring it, but if you want me to send it to you.
Yes, if you would send it to me,
Yes.
yes. Because, Doc, I'm recording the talk, and I'm gonna get it to Dr. McQuitty and get with Lenny to see if we can get it put on the website, Paul Jameson, our webmaster, see if we can get it out there. One thing for some of you who don't know is that the building we went to school in is a school again.
Right, it is.
And they are, it's a German school, and several people, like Dr. McQuitty, who was English teacher in the 60s, went back and he went up to the door and he said, he said, I used to teach in this building, and the principal was just thrilled. He said, oh, you did, how marvelous. He spent the whole day talking to English classes, got a whole tour of the building. They love to have people come and
Yes,
visit,
they
just
do.
check with the office, because, that was our school.
They have
And they love to
alumni
have
come
us
in
come
too.
back.
Well, some of the alumni have gone over and they've actually said, tell us what it was like to be a student here.
I want to know, when did they, I want to know, when did they build the officers' quarters over in Dambach? Those were not there.
I don't know when they lived there, they were there for a really long time.
We lived in them in the 60s.
I'm making
They were
court,
there in 59.
I'm making court class of 62, but we lived in Germany 1954 to 57, and then 59 to 62. This information has just come forth and been published and discussed in the New York Times Index, so you can go into that. Our parents, my mother certainly was foremost among them, out scrounging in the German junk shops. grandfather clocks, grandmother clocks, remember that stuff that they carted back to the States? Beautiful, wonderful stuff in the junk shops. This is how it got into the junk shops. When a German neighborhood was cleared out and the household goods that were left behind were then used during the war period as incentives to the factory workers and the road builders and the munitions people in lieu of pay. So of course when the war was over and the Germans had lost, then they started dumping this stuff into the junk shops. So if you've got a beautiful clock in your family, I certainly have a beautiful table in the 17th century, more than likely that table came out of a synagogue.
Yes.
So look at that stuff with a different lens.
Or a Jewish home.
Or it all came out of Jewish homes. That's what I'm saying, is that's where the stuff in the junk shops came from.
My father was the Jewish chaplain at Derby from 69 to 72. And I was just wondering if, I mean, it's a whole different ballgame for me being a kid in Germany, and my parents took us to Dachau and said, you know, you have to remember this, and you took us into the Palace of Justice and took us into that room and said, you have to remember this. But I was just a kid. But I wanted to know if any of your fathers had anything to do with the concentration camp liberations or anything, or that was before your time or anything like that.
One of the things that they required is that anybody that fought in Germany, the officers could not come over as occupation forces to Germany. They had to go to Japan and vice versa. So you probably...
Not exactly right, because when I got over there, all of the occupation troops were combat veterans from Europe.
Yeah.
And they rotated the original occupation troops out during the summer of '48. And they came back to the States, and we started getting all of these young recruits right out of basic training shipped over there for occupation duty. And as I considered myself a veteran by then, because I'd already been there a year and a half when they started bringing all these young recruits over there. And it was really a big change from starting out in Germany amongst a bunch of combat veterans that fought in Europe and liberated Europe, and all these young kids that were a year or two older than me showing up over there, and I considered them kids because they were older than me, but they grew up in little small towns in the Midwest or wherever, and they were absolutely terribly homesick when they got over there.
You need to go to the Japanese occupation forces to find
I felt like such an oddball there. I was such an oddball. I was like the only Jew in that school, and it was...
In Nuremberg in 1947, 48, we had one Jewish member, that was Stanley Racken, and Stanley, as I refer to him, was the most unforgettable character I ever met. He was an extreme extrovert. He was referred to as Rabbi Racken, everyone's father confessor, because he knew everybody's business and he was into everything. Perfect gentleman if there was a female within sight or hearing, no matter what kind of female she was. If you as much as said damn, automatically his knuckles crossed your lips. It was a knee-jerk reaction. But out in the field, he could tell the biggest lies and curse as worse than anybody. You couldn't outdo him.
Okay, Bill, thanks.
I have a question for the gentleman, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, that wrote this book that we are not allowed to see. Is there a book you would recommend that you would think would fulfill what your lifetime ambition was to find out the reason and to understand? Is there a book out there?
Not one book that I've come across, and I've spent a lot of time reading books. I had almost 300 references in this one from various books. But I've taken some classes at George Mason just to see what people say about this period. And so the history professors, they know it. The ones I've talked to, that when they talk about the period and what happened, if they've made that a career approach to their life, they know the history. But it's verbal. and they'll take a book here, a book there. But for example, on the Jewish question, there is one book put out by Hamarod. It's called Why We Watched. And if you want to read a book from the Jewish perspective of World War II, as well as in the United States during that time period, I could not recommend it more. It is a...
If you want to know about discrimination, you could go to Nebraska in the 70s. I moved to Omaha, Nebraska. Everybody thought, well, you're moving out to the Midwest where everybody's the same. Well, I got to Omaha and I found out it was divided into 6 sections. Northeast was Mormons. Northwest was Jewish. North Central was black. South Central was Hispanic. Southeast was Irish. And Southwest was Polish. And I had a couple, there was an Irish girl that had married a Polak from the other side of town. And the Irish and the Polish in South Omaha were divided by 23rd Street, which ran north and south. The Irish never crossed 23rd Street going west. The Polish never came to the Irish section across 23rd Street going east. The only one that crossed 23rd Street was the black mailman, because he wasn't Irish or Polish.
Okay, I want to put in a
Well, there's one website that's really good. It's called Twice a Stranger, and it details the history of the relocations of populations on the basis of religion that began with the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. And over again, the British are the ones who say, oh, this is a good idea. We can draw a line this way, we can draw a line that way. So it starts in 1923, and you see the tensions that are going to run right into World War II. The Potsdam Treaty, that's where all those DPs came from, because that's another big, massive drawing of new lines, and this is the problem we also have today.
Yeah, if you
So
are
Twice
looking,
a Stranger, superb, started in, the exhibition came out of Istanbul.
if you're looking for a really good, easy to deal with history of World War II, there's a company called The Teaching Company, The Great Courses.
Yes.
And they have a series of, on the World War II that is written by a university professor who speaks fluent German and got into the archives in Berlin after the Berlin Wall went down. So he's got a lot of stuff from the Russian side. It's got a lot of really good information, and it's easy to listen to. They're 30-minute lectures. There's about 48 of them, I think, in the whole thing. And if you watch watch their website, every once in a while, all of them go on sale. I've never bought a few of them for full price, but they are very expensive, so you wait for them to go on sale. But the history of World War II is excellent. Just, listen to them in the car. And that's what I do, I listen to them when I'm commuting. But it's an excellent place. I will get some of these references and put some of the stuff, when I write this up for the Trichter, I will put some of that in the Trichter. And we will try to get this recording up on the web.
How many of you have been to the Holocaust Museum here? Okay, their bookstore has some wonderful books written by people. Drexel Sprecher wrote a 2-volume thing about the trials. He was there from the beginning, 45, till it was over in May of 49. So there are a number of other books about the gypsies being
So they're getting ready to
I recommend you go if you
set up
haven't been.
the room. We want to thank these lovely people. Very interesting.
So we can't see
You can
this
thank
book.
Randy
You can look
for
at it,
sitting
yeah.
This was Nuremberg, right
When I
after
was
the war.
there. The reason I chose this
Oh, no. Oh, no, I got it.